Greetings, Missouri Mid-South Conference. I bring you greetings this week from our conference office. Last week I was in Houston with my beloved, and the day before Independence Day, my husband and I did what has become a tradition in our family, which is to go and hear the Houston Symphony at the local outdoor pavilion. As I was listening to the very beautiful patriotic music of the Houston Symphony, I began to think about how I was going to prepare my body, mind, and soul for practicing and observing Independence Day. I don't know about you, but for me, Independence Day has been, as a minister, very bittersweet. On one hand, I want to celebrate and I want to have barbecue and fireworks and do all of that. But too often it feels empty. It feels like clanging cymbals because we focus so much on the rah-rah part on Independence Day that we don't really reflect on the substance, the independence, the freedom. And I don't mean that in a cheap way of I've got freedom and, all of that kind of thing. I refer to that kind of freedom that you and I breathe as the freedom that our German evangelical immigrant ancestors came to this country and specifically to Missouri, specifically for a freedom of conscience, that they wanted to live in a place and they wanted to provide for their children and their families a place where they could believe and worship and live and work as God had called and created them to do, which might be completely different than someone down the road or elected officials. That for me is the freedom of conscience that is the cornerstone of not only for the Missouri Mid-South Conference, the evangelical tradition of the churches, but also of the United Church of Christ. And so I realized very quickly that for Independence Day, I needed to protest as an expression of my freedom of conscience. And so I drove 30 minutes from my home to downtown Houston, where there is a children's detention center. I have to confess that I didn't realize that Houston has one of the detention centers specifically for migrant children who have been separated by our government from their parents and families. And so I drove down there, and which is ironically located, I kid you not, on Emancipation Avenue. And so I joined about 100 other protesters, which I will name. In some ways was very small for Houston being the fourth largest city in the country, but also that this group of 100 was very diverse. We were of different ethnicities, different languages, different religions. I walked to the protest with a female rabbi in Houston. And we talked about how our faith tradition framed and was the foundation for why we had to protest on Independence Day. There were people of all socioeconomic backgrounds. There were LGBTQ as well as straight folks who identify as straight. There were people of all different perspectives, but we all united in one thing, which was to protest the building in which we were standing in front of, which was detaining and housing and caging children for no other reason than that their parents were doing the same thing that you would do and I would do and we would do for the children in our churches and our families and in our lives, which is to protect them and give them safety in their own lives. And so in the brutal heat of Houston, it was 99 in the shade, we protested and we shared with one another why this was important, and not just to protest, but to follow that up with letters to our elected officials and to demand that what we are doing right now is un-American in caging migrant children in this capacity. As the protest ended, I walked across the street going back to my car, and I paused to look at the building. And as a minister, I knew that I needed to do like Joshua in kind of circling the building itself. And although I couldn't literally circle it, I could circle it with prayers. Prayers for the children inside who at that very moment were crying, were afraid, were dirty, were hungry, were sleepy because they were afraid to go to sleep, who were living in their own hell. And I prayed that the Jesus that I understand and follow, who said, "Let the children come to me," that very protective Jesus would protect these children in this ugly, inhumane hell. And I said a prayer for those who allowed this to happen and continue to allow this to happen, from the top of the political administration, our current president, all the way to you and me as we look away, so that we don't have to feel the pain of knowing that there are children who are afraid because these kind of detention centers exist. I prayed that God's anger, God's righteous anger, would pierce their hearts, and that they would break open and let love and compassion protect these children and end these detention centers. As I have come back to St. Louis, I bring with me not only that expression and that experience of the protest and observing this children's detention center and knowing that I was so close to these children, and also knowing who and whose we are as the Missouri Mid-South Conference and the United Church of Christ, that we are a conference that was formed by all different immigrant faith communities who demanded that the very people who have the least power in our communities are protected and are safe by those who are harming them, and that it is our responsibility. And so I bring back this love and this appreciation that it is our evangelical churches that formed Emmaus Homes, Every Child's Hope, Unleashing Potential, Deaconess Hospital, and now Foundation, that advocates for our children. And that even and especially in this summer, as detention centers are happening all over the country, in St. Louis, that we have freedom schools for our children to make sure that they know that the freedom that they have is embedded in their very being as created in God's image. It is out of that essence of who and whose we are that we must demand of our elected officials and of our churches and of our communities that these children's detention centers must end now. Because at the end of the day, in our American history, this is a very moment that is going to go down as unethical, inhumane, un-American. And it will be equal to slavery, the internment camps, the trail of tears that we did to our Native American siblings, to Jim Crow, and to the other expressions of violence and oppression in which we have subjugated a certain people who don't have power to a lesser than role. That is not who and whose we are. So I invite you, I implore you to use your voice as a faith community in your community to demand that these children's detention centers be closed immediately. If we do not do that, then we cannot call ourselves followers of Jesus. In the name of God who creates us, the Christ who embraces those who are in harm's way, and the Holy Spirit that breaks open God's love within all. Amen.